Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Thanks for being online with me today, since we can't be here together in person. Today's presentation I want to go over is crop pests. This is a major loss of dollars to producers around the world. It includes weeds, insects, birds, and disease organisms. So let's get started. So what's a pest? Well, we could say that a pest is an organism that is annoying and bothersome and can cause economic damage. And this is an all-inclusive word. It means insects, plants, microbes, etc. And we kill pests with a pesticide. So when you hear the word pesticide, that means that it's simply something that kills a pest. Now, not all organisms that fall into the above listed groups are pests, right? Corn in a cornfield is great. Corn in a soybean field is a pest. It's a weed. So it's situational based on human constraints. In nature, there really aren't judgments on organisms, whether something is a weed or not a weed, or a pest or not a pest. Also, whether a plant is illegal to possess or not, is not, there's no worry with that in Mother Nature. But when humans get involved, then we make judgments on organisms, and we certainly do, trying to protect a financial investment with pests. So let's start off by talking about insects, which is probably what most people jump to in their mind when you think of a pest. First of all, let me say that very few insects are harmful. The majority of insects are actually beneficial. And of the nearly 1 million at least, we're always discovering more, but around 1 million species that we've discovered, a million, only 600 or so are pests. So that's like 0.006%, or so. It's a tiny little fraction of all the insects. But we estimate that globally, 5% of crop yield loss, which is money, right, is from insects. And so they do play an important role in economic and agricultural success. Sometimes if your margin is for profit or loss is 4%, 3%, having 5% loss by insects can swamp you out and make you lose money. This does not include, by the way, the cost of decreased quality that you get docked with your grain or hay or oranges or whatever it is that you're bringing to the market to sell. If it's not of the highest quality, you get a lower price. This is not included in this figure, nor is the expenses associated with spraying and control. So how do insects harm our crops? Well, you can see some pictures here. It may look familiar to you. First of all, leaf loss and damage. Well, how does leaf loss and damage affect our crop yields? Well, we've been talking about photosynthesis and the factors that affect photosynthesis and what goes into photosynthesis. Simply eating holes in the leaves or causing browning of the leaves causes a reduction of the photosynthetic area, right? The leaf area is reduced. We get a loss of value in our crops, especially with those crops that are sold based on the visual quality, such as tobacco or lettuce or ornamentals such as flowers or bedding plants or shrubs and trees. You wouldn't buy lettuce from the store or from a farmer at the farmer's market that had holes eaten in it. So we have to control those as producers, or we get reduced quality and reduced price. Then another way that insects cause damage is to damage the stem. And by damaging the stem, they do several things. First of all, when they damage the plumbing, right, the vascular system of the plant, the xylem, which carries the water, and the phloem, which carries the food, they make plants look droughty or hungry. They slow down growth and it can kill a plant outright. It can also cause reduced stem strength. So if corn stems or wheat stems are reduced in strength, they'll fall over. And when they fall over and hit the ground, they're lost. They're pretty much not harvestable. And so that's a loss. And also we get reduced yield at the top of the plant or maybe the bottom of the plant if you're talking about potatoes due to the lack of transportation of food and water throughout that plant. So they're really destructive in several ways. And then finally, they can get into our seeds and cause seed damage, which if you've just planted your crop into a field and the insects come in and eat your seeds, well, that's pretty bad, right? And if you're trying to sell your seeds and the insects have come in and laid eggs inside the seeds and they're hatching out in the grain elevator or the mill where they're grinding your grain, then that's also bad. It happens, but it's bad. Here's somebody inspecting a grass crop, a monocot crop, looking for signs of damage from insects. The main one that we have in Kentucky in corn is the European corn borer. This is an insect that gets inside the stem. You can see the larvae there. We call it a worm, but really it's a larvae. It's not really a true worm. And when they tunnel in the stalks, as is depicted on the left-hand picture, it disrupts the vascular system and weakens the stem. And on the right, the ear shank tunneling can lead to ear drop and lower yield. And you can see there, it's in the stem between the plant and the ear of corn there. It's weakening that, and it will stop water and food from getting in there and filling those grains properly, and also can cause it to fall off. So how do we control this one? Well, we used to spray some pretty raunchy pesticides, put some pretty raunchy pesticides into the ground, but now we use BT corn. BT is Bacillus thuringiensis, is what it stands for, BT. And it is a microbe that produces a protein that kills these insects, these larvae like this. And so we have genetically engineered BT into corn and soybeans and other crops so that when these insects start to eat the crops, they get a dose of that protein and they die. And this would be a GMO, a genetically modified organism. The BT protein that kills these insects does not harm people, birds, dogs, cats, children, fish. It hurts worms like this. And there's evidence of some stem borer damage there. This is a stalk that's been split in two, and you can see the damage there. Some other harmful effects of insects would be root damage. These reduce water and mineral uptake, so slow to get it water and fertilizer into the plant, which reduces growth. Can lead to lodging. When the roots are damaged, it can make the plant unsteady because one of the functions of roots, if you recall, was anchoring the plant into the soil. And so if it's interfering with the anchoring, then the entire plant can fall over in a thunderstorm. And that's called lodging. That's just when it tips over. And generally the crop is lost when it tips over. And then something you may not have thought about, which is a harmful effect of insects, is vectoring of diseases. They can spread diseases. So maybe the insect itself doesn't cause any damage, but in its gut or in its mouth parts or somewhere in or on the insect, it can infect the plant with a disease. What comes to mind for me as a horticulturist is Dutch elm disease. Our native elm trees were about 90 years ago were mostly killed out because there was a Dutch elm disease that was introduced. And it was introduced and it was carried all over the United States via a beetle, not unlike a June bug that flew around and would lay its eggs in the branches of the American elm. The beetle did no damage, very little damage. The larvae hatched and flew away and completed their life cycle, no damage. but in their gut carried the organism for Dutch elm disease. And whenever they laid their eggs, they spread that disease, and it wiped out the American elms for a long time in the United States. We now have what we call DED resistant or Dutch elm disease resistant elm trees, but it's taken a long time to recover. So damaging insects can fall into two main groups, and this is the first thing that I look for, and I think most diagnosticians look for when you're looking at plants. You want to know, is the insect doing its damage through biting and chewing? And you'll see bite marks taken out of the leaf or bite marks taken out of the fruit. These are insects with chewing mouthparts, and the damage mostly occurs during that larval stage that I showed you with the stem borer. But not always. Sometimes these adult weevils and other insects, grasshoppers, for example, can do the damage as they eat through your plants. And then there's another kind, which is maybe a little bit harder to see the damage, and it's sucking, piercing insects. These insects don't have chewing mouth parts, but they have a stylus that sticks into the leaf or the stem or the fruit, kind of like a hypodermic needle, and they start to take in the juices of the plants. They don't actually suck the juice out because the plant is under water pressure. The liquid just flows through the stylus into the body of the insect. They can't hardly not suck it. They're not sucking it out, actually. They're letting it flow into their bodies. Aphids are the big one for this one, but there's also spider mites and a host of others. And these can be difficult to control, especially in vegetable crops, greenhouses, and flowers. Well, the insect life cycle is something that you would need to know if we're studying insects. And there's two types. Not bad. Not bad. There's complete metamorphosis, and you can guess the other one's going to be incomplete metamorphosis. Let's talk about complete metamorphosis first. Complete metamorphosis are about almost 9 out of 10 insects. This is by far the default condition for insects. They have 4 distinct phases. They go through the egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And these are the ones that have the larvae there, like European corn borer. The best way to control these is not in the egg stage. It's hard to control them in the pupa stage, and it's really hard to control them in the adult stage because they're flying around so much. And so that crawling larval stage, what again you might call worm, but there's not really a worm, that's where you get them. That's when they're most vulnerable. And so you've got to know this, and you've got to know when to treat them. Most of the damage is done by, believe it or not, members of the family, the Lepidopterans, that are butterflies and moths. This is where most of our cabbage loopers, our corn borers, our tomato hornworms, they come into those categories. Houseflies can also be a problem. The other kind of life cycle is gradual or incomplete. And this is about the other 12%, 1 out of 10 or so insects. And it consists of only 3 stages, egg, nymph, and larvae. There's no adult stage. No larval stage, no pupal stage. The nymph is essentially, physically, it looks like the adult, but it lacks wings and it's just smaller. And so you can, these are a little easier to control in some ways because you can control them at any of the nymph stages because they can't fly. Eggs are sometimes hard to find or penetrate, and adults fly, and they're very hard to hit. So it's important to understand about the nymph stages and when control is possible. And these would be grasshoppers and leafhoppers and termites. Well, there's a special category of hell in insects, especially if you run a greenhouse or a vegetable operation, and it's aphids, right? A lot of people have aphids on their house plants, and they have a very interesting life cycle. They give birth to live little aphids, so they don't really fit into any of the other 2 categories that we talked about. So they're essentially born pregnant and they give birth very soon. They're not very old at all. They're giving birth again with, again, live, live babies that are pregnant. And so this is viviparous, which means live birth. We're viviparous, right? We're not born in an egg or anything. We are born live, but you can understand that with this type of system that aphid populations can get out of hand very, very quickly. And in fact, they do. Sometimes they're oviparous, which means sometimes they lay eggs, but mostly they are live birth organisms. Well, so we have evolved as a agricultural community rather, over the years, and we have adopted something for the last few decades called Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. And IPM is where we don't just spray on a certain day of the year our crops, whether they need it or not. We actually go in and do some hard work and diagnose and manage and see what stage the insects are in and determine whether we should spray or not. You know, if it's going to cause us any more to treat it than it is to control it. So this is using multiple approaches to reduce pest numbers and crop damage in an environmentally and economically responsible way, or as responsible as can be. So we're using chemical control, but also cultural control and biological control. And so this is where breeding comes in. This is where BT is a very friendly herbicide, pesticide, insecticide would come in. Let me give you an example. There are certain plants that are vulnerable to insects, but we have found that if we breed plants that have thick stems, so instead of having hollow stems, they have thick stems, then the insects have a hard time, impossible time really, laying eggs into the thick stems, and so they leave that particular variety alone. Another example is if we breed plants that have very hairy leaves or hairy stems, the insects are repelled by the hairs and can't get down to the leaf or stem surface to lay their eggs or to chew on them. And there's a lot that goes into plant breeding. It's called host plant resistance. But we use all these and more strategies to try to control our pest problems. So we use cultural control, maybe planting on a different date or planting in a different way, like in stubble or in a clean field or with a companion crop. Biological control, like ladybugs or BT. Sometimes we introduce disease organisms into a crop to control an insect pest. That's pretty satisfying. That's like hitting them with a flamethrower. We can use predator animals, insect-resistant varieties, as I have discussed. Of course, the old standby chemical control. We can also use legislative control and insect predators. So we have a tobacco budworm here. You can see that it's a larvae. It's a lepidopteran, and it likes solanaceous crops on a tomato. We would call it a tomato hornworm, but here it is getting controlled with another insect that lays its eggs on the body of the larvae and eats it alive as they hatch and grow. And so this is a great way. It's a parasitic wasp. It's a great way to control insects without spraying pesticide. There it is. And that one's going to die. So that was insects. For diseases, diseases are a little bit different. Diseases are usually microbially caused, usually a fungus or a bacteria, but not always, but usually. These are malfunctions of host cells that have been infected, and the tissue caused by the disease or the pathogen, or sometimes it's an environmental agent like smog can cause a lot of leaf damage to plants, can result in development of symptoms, and then it's up to us to figure out if it's a disease or something like a leaking natural gas or a lightning strike in a field or smog or something like that. But back to diseases. Diseases can be abiotic or non-infection, right? So abiotic means not biological. These are caused by non-biological agents and cannot be passed from plant to plant. They're not infectious, like a lightning strike or smog. And then we can have what you normally would think about as being biotic or caused by a biological agent. And these can be passed from plant to plant. So with biotic diseases, they could be, as I say, bacteria, fungi, viruses. Viruses are a big problem in certain crops like roses. Nematodes are really bad on peaches, parasitic higher plants. We looked at hemp broomrape as a parasitic higher plant, and then some mycoplasma-like organisms that we don't really understand very well that we're still trying to figure out. But not all bacteria are bad and not all fungi are bad. If we didn't have fungus, we couldn't have beer or bread, or cheese or things. And so we want to understand that most of them are not bad. And then the non-living diseases that we see could be a nutrient deficiency, could be drought, too much water, too little water, high or low temperatures, herbicide injury, or as I say, sulfur or ozone damage will cause symptoms that look like a disease when they may really not be a disease. Well, what are the harmful effects of diseases? Well, we can have premature crop death, which is really bad for yield. We could have the destruction or that should be blockage of xylem and phloem, which as we talked about in terms of insects causes lack of mobility of water and nutrition up and down the plant stem, which really hurts the root system, hurts yield. Loss of roots, production of toxic substances such as mold toxins that can kill or injure livestock or humans. The destruction of the leaf area, those lesions that we see, the rusty spots, the brown spots on leaves, that's an area that is not photosynthesizing and is causing, besides the damage that's caused to the plant, it's also losing photosynthetic area. And we can get crop failure or crop stand reduction due to seed destruction, which is obviously not good for our plants. And so in the upper left-hand corner, there's a bacterial or a viral wilt. And wilts are caused when the organisms block the xylem. So it looks like the plant doesn't get enough water, but really you could add all the water you want. It can't get up the stem because the plumbing is blocked. That'll kill a plant. Root rot will cause the plant to suffer above ground or simply to fall over. Sometimes in the lower left, we have diseases that we call rusts. There's a wheat rust. There's all kinds of rust. This is guava, which is a tropical fruit. It can also have rust, and rust gets its name because it is an orangey yellow fuzziness that occurs on the leaf or the fruit, and the fuzziness is a sporulation of the fungus. And then xanthomonas in the lower right is a bacteria. Xanthomonas leaf spot causes vascular necrosis. Necrosis is a word that means dead. Chlorosis means yellowing, and necrosis means dead. And so that's some dying tissue there that's going to cause the stem to look bad. And that's on a plant that is an ornamental plant that needs to look good. And so that would ruin that particular plant. Reducing the crop value on mulberry sclerotia are the bigger round structures at the top of those two fruit clusters there. And sclerotia are interesting. They are fungal, part of a fungus that when times are tough or the fungus is about to go dormant, sometimes they'll go into the sclerotia, which can lie dormant but viable in the soil for a decade or more. And when the conditions are right, they reappear and infect your crop. Anthracnose is a fungal problem on dogwoods and redbuds and sycamores and beans in this case. It's kind of a general term for lesions. Now that crop there and those beans, those are not sellable, right? You couldn't sell those at the farmer's market and you couldn't do anything with them. Lower left is a papaya, and you can see there's a fruit spot of papaya, which renders it not good to eat. And then tomato, also Rhizoctonia, which is a tomato solani, refers to the fact that it is attacking things in the Solanum solanaceae family. We have early rot in cranberry, and so those you wouldn't want to eat those cranberries at Thanksgiving dinner. It ruins the crop there. We get gibberella ear rot, which is a fungus in corn, which makes it unsellable. Southern corn blight and rust spots on peach. Again, all these things render it unsellable. If you're a tobacco grower, you get to sell your crop based on the size of the leaf and the beauty of the leaf and the cleanliness of the leaf. And so this one has some problems, right? You're going to get docked on this one, especially on the one in the lower right, because of some disease problem. Now, there's a very important relationship that I want you to know about diseases, and it's called the disease triangle. And you should know the disease triangle. So in order to have a disease, this is for humans, this is for cattle, this is for dogs, cats, it's also for crops. You have to have three things present to have disease. If one of these three things is missing, then the disease does not occur. You have to have a favorable environment. It has to be wet or cold or dry or stressful or whatever. You have to have a susceptible host. If the host isn't susceptible, it won't matter. You have to have a plant or a human or a dog or a cow that's susceptible, and then you have to have the presence of the organism itself. And when all three of these things are present, you're going to have disease. In order to stop disease, you take away one of these three and the disease disappears. Think of it as being a three-legged stool. And when you take one of the legs off of the three-legged stool, the stool falls over, the disease goes away. So it's a really simple but powerful way of thinking about diseases. It's called the disease triangle. Well, we can try to regulate diseases through regulatory legislative control. You can't grow certain crops, right? We can't bring citrus into Florida or California. You can't bring plants from or fruits from another country into this country. Right? The USDA controls some of that. That's a way to exclude diseases from entering into our country. Cultural control, we try to keep the leaves dry. We don't water at night on plants and vegetables and turf grass because that's how you get diseases, because the mold will start to grow on the wet leaves overnight because they don't dry out. So for instance, you would change your irrigation schedule to irrigate your plants, especially if you're getting the leaves wet in the morning so that they can dry out by nightfall. We can introduce biological control agents, and we've talked about those that can help us with control. And frankly, we can plant disease-resistant varieties. And you can go through seed catalogs, plant catalogs, and you can find disease-resistant varieties, and you should plant those. And you should not plant the old-fashioned susceptible varieties if possible. And then, we can heat plants or refrigerate plants or irradiate plants with radiation to control some diseases or to prevent diseases from spreading. And we do this. And that's good. And finally, we can spray them, right? But we don't like to spray them. It's expensive to spray them, and the public generally doesn't like us to spray them. And so we put that last on the list, but it's certainly on the list. Now let's talk. The third type of pests is my favorite. It's weeds, weed management. The abnormal psychology of plants. So what's a weed? Again, a weed is a man-made definition. It's a plant growing out of place. And so, again, if I had a corn plant growing in a cornfield, that is a desirable plant. But if I have a corn plant growing in a soybean field, that's a weed. It's the same plant. It's just growing in a different setting. And so humans make these judgments against plants and call things weeds or not weeds. Now, a lot of crops have major losses due to weeds. Competition is the big one. Light competition, water competition, nutrient competition. It's a real problem. We can also, though, beyond competition, we can get reduced crop value. So if you have certain weeds in your cotton and it stains the cotton, right, you're going to get less money for your cotton. toxic plants in hay is a no-no, and you can't sell your hay or you'll have to sell it for just practically nothing. Wild garlic and grain crops, what does that do? Well, it makes your, if you feed it to cattle, or you put cattle out on a pasture and they've got wild onion or wild garlic, the milk will taste a little off. And in grains, it'll take the grain will taste a little off. And then weed seeds in grain are a no-no because when you replant those seeds, the next year you're replanting weed seeds into your field. And so these are all ways that weeds reduce our crop value. And then not only do they reduce the yield and they reduce the value of the little yield that we get, but they also increase production costs. You got to control them. You got to plow. You've got to cultivate early in the season to try to cultivate out the weeds, but not hurt the crops that much. We can get into human and animal health problems with weeds. Some are toxic, some are psychedelic. Certainly, it slows down the harvest, especially if you've got a vine and you have to go out there and untangle that vine every few feet when you're trying to get through your field. And then weeds host other pests like insects and diseases that do more harm than the weed itself. So weeds are a handful and always have been. So here's a cornfield with some weeds in it, right? And then here's a cornfield that has had a herbicide applied to it to reduce the weeds. This is competition. This is pure competition. So compare the clean looking crop on the left two rows and then the weedy looking crops on the right two rows. In fact, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows of crops there essentially, 4 or 5 in that newest bottom picture. The left two are the tallest and the best looking. The next one is kind of moderate, but the 1 or 2 rows growing on the far right that are swamped in weeds, they're small and they're not going to make much yield, if any, and that'll be a crop failure. So you can see with these pictures show you the damage just competition wise that weeds can bring to a crop. That's why it's important that we always try to protect our crops and get an early start and control those weeds. Well, why do weeds have such an advantage over our crops? I've mentioned it a couple of times in class, but our crops are they've been bred for thousands of years, more intensely bred the last 100 years, and they can be prima donnas. They don't have a big root system. They're not very competitive anymore. Their roots don't go very deep. Their leaves don't go very strongly upwards, or outwards. They don't get very tall. We've asked them to put their energy into making grain for us, and at the expense of making roots and leaves that are competitive. So we have to keep the weeds at bay to make them happy. Weeds, on the other hand, have always been weeds, and they've always been aggressive. They have rapidly canopy development, right? Their leaves and stems grow so fast and they overtop our crops very early. And I've mentioned it before, but when you get a weed that overtopped your crop, you're done. That's it. It's over. The game is over in the first few weeks of the season. So early season control is critical. They also tend to have larger leaves, and the leaves develop rapidly. Why? Because they haven't been genetically bred to make grain. All they want to do is just grow and get big. They have early and rapid development of the root systems. They produce a huge number of seeds, small seeds, but seeds. They can change their growth pattern. Pigweeds can, dandelions can, right after you mow it a few times. The lawn, the dandelions don't stick their heads up anymore. They stay low. They adapt. They learn. They're smart. They can be allelopathic, which we're not going to focus on too much, but they can release harmful chemicals into the soil. The best example of this would be black walnut trees that release a chemical called juglone into the soil, and few plants can grow beneath a black walnut tree. Tomatoes are especially sensitive to this crop, so you would never grow tomatoes near a black walnut tree. And they have some interesting dispersal mechanisms, as we've talked about. Yeah, next year we got to pull the velvet leaf out of the beans a lot earlier. We got to get that velvet leaf out of the soybeans. It's a real tough weed, in soybeans. It turns out the seed of velvet leaf has evolved or been selected to mimic the size of soybean seeds. And so it goes into the drill when you're planting them into the field in the spring, and you're drilling velvet leaf in there. We talked about stems and roots and the growing points and how strong they can be. I complimented the root system of plants and how they can split house foundations and boulders, but the stems can do a pretty good job too. This is probably Johnson grass, but it's coming up through an asphalt road. They have a strong will to live, and they are survivors. So how do we manage weeds? Well, we have cultural methods. We can choose a variety that germinates early or is aggressive, grows as fast as possible. We rotate our crops. The big rotation here in this part of the world is corn and then soybean and then corn and then soybean. 1 year corn, 1 year soybean. If you think about a corn and a soybean plant, even if you don't know that much about them, you recognize that one is a giant grass-looking plant, and then one is a lower, although soybeans get waist high, but they're more of a canopy, and those are dicots, and grass is a monocot. Corn is a monocot. It's a grass. And so the weeds will be different, and the weed strategies are different in corn and soybeans, and by alternating, we can keep the weeds off base. We can keep them at a bit of a disadvantage. We can only buy certified weed-free seed, if such a thing exists. We can do a good job of making sure that we have proper row spacing and plant population. Field corn is about 28 to 30, or somewhere around 30, or a little more, a little less, 30,000 plants per acre. And so if we only plant 20,000 plants per acre, because we're trying to save money putting that expensive seed down, then there's going to be a lot of bare ground out there, and the weeds are going to get to take an advantage of it, right? So we want to make sure we have proper row spacing and plant population. Make sure that our fields are fertilized, watered if possible, but fertilized. Remember, weeds, and they go down deep if they need to. They can get all the fertilizer they want, but our crops, we've told our crops to focus on other things that will take care of the fertilizer for them, so we need to do that. And we can move the planting date up or the harvesting date, depending on the crop that we're talking about. For instance, let me tell you an example that I have some experience with is growing some cabbage and kale. When you want to plant it in the spring, but if you plant it in the spring, the cabbage loopers come in, the little moths come in and they lay eggs, and they're hard to control. You get harlequin beetles, they're hard to control. But if you plant your kale or cabbage in the fall, the populations of insects that are harmful are a lot reduced. So simply by changing the time of year that you plant the crop can really make a big difference in weeds, or in this case insects. As I've told you, just these cultural controls can make a big difference. Now we can have mechanical methods, right? We can hoe, we can till. There's something in soils, in any soil, not just agricultural soil, but any soil, called the seed bank. And so if you go out to a forest and you dig up a bunch of soil and you spread it out and germinate it, to see what germinates, you'll get all kinds of plants germinating from that seed bank. Well, agricultural fields also have a seed bank, and a lot of times the seed bank consists of weed seeds. And so by tilling, we either don't till much and we keep the weed seeds buried where they don't germinate, or we turn them over so that they see oxygen and sunlight and water and they germinate, and then we kill them with either a spray or more tillage. So we can till our fields, wait for the weeds to pop up, till it again, and kill those weeds, and then we can plant our crop and put our crops at an advantage. When we cultivate down the row, though, we want to do it early, because if we do it too late, the roots will be out in the middle of the row and we'll damage them with our cultivation equipment. So we want to do it as early as possible. We can also mow and clip in pastures and things like this. We can remove the seed heads. So if you have a field and you've got purple thistles growing out there, you may not be able to go out and kill each thistle, but at least you can go out and clip the seed head off and drop it in a trash bag and haul it away, or throw it in the trash, tie it up and throw it in the trash. So this is a young crop, and you can see it's got very uniform row spacing, the distance between the rows, and then within the rows, it looks like that plant population is pretty thick and should be pretty competitive. But this early stage in the crop's life, you see that there's a lot of sunlight hitting the bare soil. And so you see some weeds starting to pop up there. So this producer is running through with an implement to disrupt the root system, or to completely uproot the weeds, trying not to disturb the root system of the crops. Sometimes we have to put chemicals in our on our field, the herbicide, the weed killers, right? So this gentleman has a mailbox and it's got weeds on it, so he's going to the store to buy some weed killer, and then he'll spray it on the around his mailbox. I've got a mailbox that looks like the one on the left. It's weedy, and I don't spray anything, but it's all right. Oops, that one didn't work out too well. But generally, you can spray around mailboxes, and herbicides are a good alternative for weeds. But you have to be careful when you're applying herbicides. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see that corn got hammered by improper herbicide or improper placement or timing of the herbicide. And that lower right-hand picture, you can see there's a couple of stunted corn rows there. Those are never going to produce any yield. And so we want to, you need to hire somebody or really read up on your herbicides and become an expert in herbicides. Now, for every pesticide, there are important federal regulations, and it's called the label, the specimen label. The label is a federally mandated document, and it is a legal document. The label is a legal, I'll say it again, the label is a legal document, and you have to use the product according to the label. The labels are complicated, complex, sometimes baffling, but they are a legal document. If you use a pesticide not in accordance with the label and you damage your field, the company who makes it owes you nothing. They owe you nothing. It's called going off label. You went off label, hey, that's like when it says don't pull the tag off the mattress and under penalty of law. Well, you pulled the tag off the mattress, and so you got to take your lumps. There are MSDS sheets. MSDS sheets are material safety data sheets, and you can get these you can look them up online from the label. But here's an example of the safety sheets here. It says, for instance, if you're spraying something like Redeem, it says grazing or harvesting green forage. Okay, if you're spraying it and you have lactating dairy animals, do not graze or harvest the green forage from the treated area for 14 days after treatment. So you have a 14-day window that's closed, and then after 14 days, it's safe to turn the cattle out onto it if they're producing milk. But for other livestock, such as beef producers, there are no grazing restrictions, and so that is a lactating mama cow restriction only. But things like that, it'll say on here, there's later on it talks about slaughter restrictions, withdraw livestock from grazing treated grass or consumption of treated hay at least 3 days before slaughter to let it clear their system. They're going to pee it out, poop it out, the metabolites from this Redeem, and then they're clean when you take them to be slaughtered. Now, we spray chemicals, right? We've been talking about a label and spraying. So herbicides are classified based on several things. One is, do they kill broadleaves or grasses? In other words, do they kill dicots or monocots. And this is why I have emphasized the differences between monocots and dicots through the semester, is that it's the same as broadleaf versus grasses. So if I have a herbicide that only kills broadleaves or dicots, then I can spray it in my grass, my corn, my Bermuda grass, my turf grass, whatever I've got, my sugar cane, whatever I've got, and it'll kill the broadleaf weeds and it won't hurt the grasses. Or vice versa, I can spray things that will kill the broadleaves and not hurt my grasses. We can also classify herbicides based on whether they move within the plant or they just burn the crap out of the leaf that they land on. We call that contact, which is like a flamethrower, right? It just burns what it hits, but then it doesn't move around in the plant. That's very useful. I like when I use herbicides, I like this kind because it's a little safer in many ways, but it doesn't move to the root system to kill the root system of the weed. And so in that case, you want to get something that's translocated, and Roundup is probably the most famous herbicide that translocates to the roots. We can classify them based on the mode of action. There are so many kinds of modes of action. A mode of action is a way that the herbicide works. What biochemical function does it disrupt in the plant? For instance, a photosynthetic inhibitor causes the plant not to photosynthesize. Well, that's pretty fatal to the plant. But also, because the process, as we've learned, the process of photosynthesis has energy in it, right? That photon comes in and the light reaction, there's a lot of energy there. The photosynthesis inhibitor, that energy that hits the leaf causes more destruction and more destruction. And it really looks like you've taken a blowtorch to the leaf. It's like pouring acid on the leaf. And then there's time of application. We can put down herbicide before we plant our crop. That's called pre-plant. We don't do that so much anymore, but we used to do it a lot more. The main ones we use now are pre-emerge and post-emerge. And the emerge refers to the crop, not the weed. And so for pre-emerge, we apply it prior to the emergence of the crops or the weeds, right? We try to catch the weeds, but mainly the crops. And so as the little weed seed, this is applied to the bare soil. And as the weed seeds germinate and encounter that chemical that's been applied to the bare soil, it kills them. It's pre-emerged, but we put it in such a way that it doesn't kill the crop. We put the crop seeds deeper so that they don't really encounter that layer of chemistry with anything that's sensitive as they come up through the deeper soil layers. And then there's post-emergent, which is probably what you're most familiar with. Roundup, for instance, or dicamba 2,4-D. After the weeds are up, then you spray them, right? After the weeds are up, you kill them. The best way, the most efficient way to kill weeds is before they come up. So either pre-plant or pre-emerge. Once they've come up, they're causing damage, and then you've got to try to spray the weed and not kill your crop, right? And so it becomes a little more tricky, but most people wind up killing weeds with post-emergent herbicides. So if you use herbicides and you use them the right way, and if you're a corn farmer, soybean farmer, or a pear or an apple farmer, it doesn't really matter, then they'll work for you quite well. And you can have weed-free fields too, and higher yields and happy-looking plants. I've enjoyed being with you today. Thank you.